So also, how about a hand for Yavapai College to have a lecture series, right? I have taught here now for over 11 years, and I've often said, why don't we have a lecture series, right? And so this is a great thing. And I've been to at least one of these so far, and last week with Meg Borman, and it was fabulous. So hopefully you think this is fabulous too, but if you don't, just keep it to yourself. All right, so why am I giving a talk on this? If you've read my little blurb, you know that I'm a lawyer, that I teach criminal justice. I also run the paralegal program, the Administration of Justice program. And so why would I be talking about this, right? I mean, it's not within my field. I'm normally teaching criminology, constitutional law, or my favorite, serial killers. It's the one that the students like the best, serial killers class. So what am I doing here? I will also tell you that I'm on sabbatical right now, and I'm writing a paper for publication in a legal journal on the effects of neuroscience and brain scans on the law. And I also have a master's degree in consciousness studies. I'm a strange fellow, okay?
Yes, you are.
Oh. And they're recording that. Are the comments in the audience showing up on this, or is it just me? Oh, good. So no one will know. Oh, closed caption. So no one will know that. So I have a lifelong interest in Christianity. I'm a lifelong believer. I became an Episcopal Church in my late teens, and I did a doctoral thesis where I was looking at whether or not the New Testament canon, the body of books that we're going to talk about today, should be closed. And I argued that there's no reason for it to be closed, that God didn't stop talking to us 1900 or 1800 years ago. That's a radical position, okay? I'm going to take a lot of radical position today, or at least it may seem that way to you. But keep in mind that I'm here as a historian. I'm not here as a preacher. I'm not here as a member of a church. I'm not going to try to change your mind on anything. I'm not here to defend anything. I think facts matter, right? I mean, that's a slogan we have right now in our political world, right? Facts matter. And I think facts matter even on things like faith. And so I think this is a neat story. I delved into this topic as part of my thesis, and I thought I would like to share this with a larger group. So if you have questions, I can take a few as we bop along. I'm going to try to move through a lot of material real quick. This is obviously, we're doing something in an hour that you could take a college class on, or you could take 2 college classes on, right? I mean, so we're just going to blow through a lot of this. If your comment is, or question is something that I'll get to, I'll hold you off, and I'm not being rude when I do that, okay? So I want to get through a lot, get to the point where we can have some questions, have some dialogue at the end. How about a trick question? Let's start with that. Who wrote the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark?
Charles.
Charles. Does anyone know who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Mark! Okay, trick question. Most of you just got that wrong. What we're going to find out is the story that was handed down to us as a matter of faith is a little bit different than the story that's been handed down to us as a matter of history, okay? And hopefully we can find a place where those two come together. All right? Why do we talk about the New Testament? Greatest book ever written, right? That's why you're here. You're not here to hear from me. You're here to hear about the New Testament. Most of you don't even know me. The New Testament, best-selling book of all time, the Bible. Western civilization, Western culture, completely influenced by the New Testament, the Bible. The largest faith in the world today is Christian. If my memory's right. Does anybody know who the second faith is? Is it Islam? That's what I'm assuming. And then probably Hindu's third. Am I right? Not sure. So it's an important book to talk about, right? It has tremendous repercussions for history, our lives, our country, etc.
And law.
And law, right? There's no question that in medieval times, the centerpiece of the law, and we don't have a lot of law really until modern times. What you and I think of as the law today really has no counterpart in the medieval world. There were very few rules. Most of the rules were church rules. Those were more important than the king's rules, and there were very few rules of the king. But our sources of Western law all flowed from the Bible, and a lot of that flows out of the Ten Commandments, right?
Got you sidetracked.
No, not at all. Good question. So here's the first issue that we get. Again, does anybody know when the first New Testament is put together? Just off the top of your head. You don't know this? You don't have this on the top of your head?
The entire canon?
The entire canon.
I think it was Nice, wasn't it? Or the Nicene Council?
No. No.
4th century Constantine.
After Constantine, that's right. So, does anybody remember when Jesus died? You remember that year?
Roughly 33 AD.
Yeah, we don't know.
Or 33.
Yeah. Historians will say anywhere from 29 to 33, but it's interesting, we don't know. We don't have an exact record of the time of his death. Typically, what I'm throwing out at you today is kind of numbers that are a consensus. But anyway, around 30 is what I have. 33 is another common choice. I've even seen 29. So 30 AD, okay? And so that's roughly a little less than 2,000 years ago. The first New Testament that we have a record of is somewhere around 350 or 360. So 330, 340 years after the death of Jesus. It's a long time. It's 100 years longer than the United States has been in existence. Maybe at the end we can talk about the Nicene Council, Charles, that you raised. But actually the Bible wasn't, the books of the Bible wasn't discussed there. There was the divinity of Jesus. And the argument that we now have today, the Trinity, flows out of the Council of Nicaea. Again, that's in something like 320, 330. So hundreds and hundreds of years after the death of Jesus is when we begin to get the things that we think of as our faith to get formed. We don't have any of the original copies of the New Testament. So all we have are reprints. And in those days, all reprints are done by hand, done by scribes. Which means what? Monks. Which means what? It's full of errors. All the copies that we have of the New Testament, hundreds of thousands of misspellings, errors, contradictions, translation issues. We'll talk about translations in a minute. But we don't have the original books. The books that have been translated into the New Testament are in Greek. And yet we know all the disciples were Jewish and spoke Aramaic. So instantly we have a translation issue, right? We have the original writings would have had to have been put into Greek, or they were written by Greek speakers, which is another problem, and we'll look at that in a minute. So again, I'm not here to bash your faith or to even increase your faith. I'm here to give you some facts, and we'll talk about the implications of this, afterwards. Because there's a couple different ways of thinking about this. This can make you mad. This can confirm what you already think. This can make you curious to know more. That's my goal, curiosity. But it can affect your faith, or it can reinforce your faith. That's up to you. But the key, and the reason why I spend time on a topic like this, is to know as best we can what really happened. I'll give you a bit of scripture, right? We shouldn't do a talk like this without some scripture, right? Matthew 22, 34 through 39, quote, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together, one of them, an expert in the law, coincidence, tested him with this question. They're talking to Jesus. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And of course, at this point, they're trying to trick him, right? I don't like this guy, Jesus. things they don't like and challenging their authority. And so they're trying to trick them. So what's the greatest commandment, genius? Right? It's basically what they're saying here. Jesus replies, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. Oh. Could have stopped with all your heart and all your soul. Or Jesus could have said, love God with faith. Didn't. Says the greatest commandment is to love God with your mind. That's what we're doing today. Loving God with your mind to me means we look at it, we think about it, we don't buy what someone else has told us. We work hard if it's important to us to understand it. We look at both sides. I tell my students, if you feel strongly about something, go find the most important person that you've ever seen or heard of that disagrees with you and read everything from them you can. If you don't believe in abortion, go find the best book on pro-choice. Whatever it is, go read the person that will upset you the most and go get their viewpoint. You'll be fascinated what an interesting process that can be. It's an old-fashioned idea. It's called tolerance and dialogue. Okay, so love God with your mind. First commandment. With Paul, all of you know about Paul, I hope, right? Hopefully you all have a general understanding of the Bible. I don't have to start at the beginning because that won't work. But Paul is the first missionary, the greatest missionary. In fact, I would argue he's the greatest missionary that's ever lived. Now, what Paul does in basically setting the stage for the conversion of the Roman Empire is just unbelievable. And he basically does this single-handedly because the original disciples are Jewish. They don't think Jesus has abrogated Judaism. The very first church that we have record of in Acts is a Jewish church run by his brother James. Jewish law. Now they believe Jesus is the Messiah. Normal Jews didn't. And they encouraged their fellow Jews to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. But Paul is the fellow who goes off and teaches to the Gentiles. And this is because Jesus has a little chat with him on the road to Damascus, right? You're familiar with this story. Jesus shows up and says, what are you doing? Blinds him. And then he has a total change of heart. In fact, he goes from a persecutor of Christians as a Jew, a Pharisee, to then being the greatest missionary of all time. We'll talk about him in a little bit more at the end because Paul's teachings are fascinating. But here's the problem. Paul never met Jesus. Paul was not an eyewitness to any of the things that were done when you read the Gospels. And in fact, Paul's letters never mention the Gospels. Why do you think that is?
They haven't been written yet.
Oh man, you are good. They hadn't been written yet. So Paul has our first writings. What's interesting is his writings come later in the New Testament. The compilers did not put him first. There's probably reasons for that. But in the 50s, so Jesus dies somewhere around 30, 33. In the 50s, then Paul is on his ministry and begins writing his letters. When do you think the next gospel shows up? Does anyone have any knowledge of this? So the first gospel we believe is the Gospel of Mark. And that shows up, I believe, in 70. Check my notes because I don't want to say anything on tape that's wrong. I say enough things wrong off tape. So 70. So that's at least 40 years after the death of Jesus that we get our first gospel. Paul's writings are in the 50s, some 20 years or more after the death of Jesus. But Paul's not an eyewitness. And yet one could argue today that if you look at the church, particularly the Catholic Church, Paul's more important than Jesus. All right? The whole Catholic Church in the Middle Ages became premised on a Paul view of the Gospels, of the life and ministry of Jesus. That should fascinate you. That should make you scratch your head. As I mentioned, we don't have any of the original writings. And all the original copies that we have are in Greek. Now, what we think happened is in that intervening period after Jesus' death around 30, 33, and then the first gospel around 70, is that there was an oral tradition, that people shared ideas, teachings, memories, people that had seen him teach. The disciples went out and proselytized. And so we got and traditions, and they were all oral. Nothing had been written down at this point. If anything was written down, we have no record of it, and we have no record of it from the church, right? Because a lot of the things I'm going to share with you today come from the early church fathers. That's how we know how the New Testament got put together. James, Peter, and Paul die in the 50s or 60s, and then Jerusalem is sacked in 70. That's where the Romans come in and level Jerusalem, scattered the Jews all over the world. This has a momentous effect on the path of Christianity because all the original Christians are Jews living in Jerusalem. They are either killed or dispersed or taken into slavery. Jewish Christianity dies in 70 AD. So, we know that Mark's gospel is after that because of references within Mark's gospel. Anybody here heard of the Gospel of Q? Q. Okay, it's a German word which means source. So what all scholars now, it's probably 80% of scholars now, believe is that there is a gospel that we don't have even a copy of. They call it the Gospel of Q, and it's called the source gospel because huge amounts of what's in Mark, huge amounts of what's in Matthew and Luke use exactly the same phrases and exactly the same words, even though they're written by different people at different times. So that means they're copying from a source. So the Q source is believed to be a sayings gospel of some sort. That's actually the source of the later gospels. How about the Gospel of Thomas? Anybody heard of the Gospel of Thomas? Yeah. So we hear about that in early church fathers. They didn't like it. The first copy, I think, or first translation we get is 1959 because the Gospel of Thomas had been ordered to be destroyed by the early church fathers. Very cool story that I will share with you today. There is a 5 million person congregation of Christians in India. 5 million. They've survived all this time in a basically Hindu and Muslim country. And that 5 million people that church was started by Thomas. So Thomas goes to India. The Bible that they use is the Gospel of Thomas. Unfortunately, the Portuguese show up in the 1500s. They find out about this group and they order all copies of all the church records to be burned. Lovely idea, right? Just to destroy things we don't agree with or we don't like. And so we didn't get a copy of this until much later. Do any of you recall Nag Hammadi or the Gnostic Gospels? So we didn't discover copies of these until the 1940s. Now they're referenced in the early church fathers, but we didn't have copies of them. And now we have dozens of the Gnostic Gospels. And so now we know that there were different Christian communities during the time that the New Testament is put together, and that they used different books. And I'll talk more about that later. So here is the traditional progression. And again, these dates aren't exact. We don't know the exact date that Jesus died. We don't know the exact date that these Gospels were written. They're not dated. Mark, we think somewhere around 70. Matthew, somewhere around 85 to 90. Luke, about the same, 85 to 90. Acts, somewhere between 80 and 100. It's believed that Luke and Acts are the same author. Revelation, I'll talk about. That's probably around 95, the Apocalypse. And then John. John's the most controversial book, really, in the Bible, I think. John comes much later. I think most historians think somewhere around 90 or 100 although some argue it's much, much later. So look at these dates for a minute now. So the very first one's 40 years after Jesus' death, and the last one is at least 70 years, maybe more, after Jesus' death. So there's some question whether these are even written by eyewitnesses. And in fact, 2 of them we know are not. Even the original church does not argue that Mark and Luke are eyewitnesses. So, but keep that in mind. From 70 to 100 is when we think these Gospels are put down by scribes. Here's the other rub. They're all anonymous. John says it's written by the disciple that Jesus loved. A little presumptuous, isn't it? Well, we don't know who that is, right? The early church fathers thought, he loved John the most. Well, we have no knowledge of that. We have no record of that. In fact, we have a Gnostic gospel, which I'll talk about more, that says he loved Mary Magdalene the most. And this made the disciples very mad. In fact, Peter attacked her and tried to silence her. That's in the Gospel of Mary, which you've probably never heard of. It's not in what you and I would call the New Testament. So, Paul writes 13 letters plus Hebrews is believed to be written by Paul. Here's the problem. We don't think Paul wrote all of those. In fact, we're almost sure of it. We're almost sure that 3 of the letters are forgeries. Now, when I first learned about this, I went through the roof. Can you imagine? It'd be like finding the good book today, right? And saying, well, there's some things in there I don't really like. No one's looking. So I'm copying them. I'm the scribe. I'm going to make a few changes. And then I'm going to write Paul's name on it. This is outrageous, right? But we know in the early world at this time, there's a lot of forgeries. We have forgeries among pagan philosophers and scholars, and we have forgeries among Christians. It's common, but keep in mind let's keep in mind the time. Almost no one knows how to read and write anywhere in the world at this time. Okay, it's easy to cheat. It's easy to lie. It's easy to make changes to documents. Very few people have copies of these documents. There aren't libraries like we think of today. What do you think of this nice library here in Yavapai? Hopefully you're using it. And so there's a lot of questions, right, about how these things got handled, who was doing the forgery, etc. The 3 books that we're almost there's 4 books that we're almost certain Paul did not write is Ephesians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Now, if you're a Bible scholar, the last 3, the 2 Timothys and Titus, are called the pastoral letters. And they form the basis of the church, how the church created a lot of its practices, etc., came out of those teachings. Forgeries, made up. Why do we think they're forgeries? Well, sometimes it's completely style difference. If you look at my writing over the years, I haven't really changed my vocabulary that much, haven't changed my style, so there's style differences. We also know there's forgeries when some of his letters reference things after his death. Oops. That's a screw up there by the scribe, right? We also know or believe they're forgeries because they contradict things that Paul said. Paul was an apocalyptic believer. He thought the second coming of Christ was, and so his early writings say, why are you even bothering to get married? Waste of time. Why are you having kids? Jesus is going to come back any day now, and there's going to be the rapture. I don't think he used that word, but we're going to be risen, ascended. So why bother? Then when you get to pastoral letters, Paul is saying, oh yeah, marriage is great. Make sure you have lots of kids. Make sure you raise them in the faith. Doesn't look good, right? So there's real contradictions here. There's 2 that scholars argue about, Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. And then also the Epistle to the Hebrews is virtually believed by all scholars not to be written by Paul. This might be something you haven't heard of before. Why don't we hear this in our churches? Why don't our priests and our preachers tell us this? One of the scholars that I will recommend to you at the end here today is Raymond Brown. Hopefully you've heard of him. Probably the preeminent Catholic Bible scholar on the face of the earth. He's not with us anymore. But if you know anything about the Catholic Church, you don't get to critically think or write things that are controversial very much. Or you get thrown out. They run a pretty tight ship. In Protestantism, we've got thousands of different iterations, right? There's no central authority policing teachings like there is in
First name?
Raymond. I'll give you some of his books here at the end. But anything by Raymond Brown is worth reading. He was appointed by Pope John Paul, twice to the Vatican Biblical Commission, and so he's considered, a heavyweight. And he priests, Catholic priests, for not telling the truth in the pulpit. Very interesting reading. His argument is, this stuff shouldn't affect your faith. Sure there's questions, sure there's mistakes, sure there's errors, sure there's controversies, sure there's forgeries, but the point remains the same, right? And so keep in mind that one of the ways Paul helped convert Rome is he argued Christianity was true. He said, not like that stone god over here. That's perfect, right? That's like a pagan god sitting there. You'd have that on your fireplace mantle in Rome, along with about 20 others, right? Your favorites. The god of the fertility and the god of spring. And Paul said, those are just stones. Those are fake. Not the living God. And he argued facts that distinguished pagan beliefs in deities from 2,000 years ago that started in Babylon.
What happens to inerrancy?
We'll talk about that at the end. Inerrancy, the idea that all this is divinely inspired. I'll spend a little bit of, this is a good time to bring that up because that's key, right? The larger evangelical community believes that these books are divinely inspired. There's a couple of problems with that. If that's true, then the folks that wrote it down, that were inspired by God and wrote it down, screwed up. And that's very possible. Because what happens? Revelation comes through a human mind. It comes through a person full of bias, teachings, beliefs. Paul is a Pharisee Jew before he converts. But guess what? Throughout his letters, he speaks like a Pharisee Jew. Clearly he loves it, but he didn't give up his Jewish faith. Paul doesn't create a new faith. Go read his letters. And by the way, I would challenge anybody to come up to me after we're done and tell me what any one of Paul's letters means. Have any of you tried to read any of his letters? Oh my. I'm also terribly interested in quantum physics. I'll read quantum physics I'll get more from reading quantum physics than I will from figuring out Paul. Immensely complicated. Immensely difficult to really get the point. And of course, lots of arguments over translation again. All right, so when did Mark get named? So the Gospel of Mark's anonymous. If you go read Mark today, Mark never mentions Mark. Mark doesn't say, I walked with Jesus, I was a disciple, I want to tell his story, here I am. Completely anonymous. That's odd, isn't it? Don't you think that you would gain standing by saying that you were a disciple, or gain standing by saying that you walked with one of the disciples and you're writing down their story? But you don't get that. Mark's also the first gospel, but it doesn't show up first. And that's because it's the shortest gospel. Matthew is first in the Bible. The first time we get any record of Mark being named is in the year 140. This is 110 years after the death of Jesus. It comes from Papias. And he says that he had heard that Mark was a companion of Peter. And that Mark was attempting to write down the things that Peter had taught him. One of the problems with that is go read Mark. Gospel of Mark makes Peter look very foolish. Constantly, Jesus is asking the disciples, who do they say I am? Who do you believe I am? What is the message? And in the Bible, in the various Gospels, we'll get different answers. And every single time they're wrong, and usually Peter's the most wrong. It's fascinating. Read it with a critical eye. Go back and look for that. Peter's constantly wrong. Jesus is going, no. Here's what I'm trying to say. It's always different. It's fascinating. Matthew, we think, is written somewhere around 85 to 90. It's anonymous again. In fact, Matthew's referenced in the Gospel of Matthew in the third person. Confusing. Also, 91% of Mark ends up in Matthew. In other words, exact same phrases, exact same writing style. We talked about the Gospel of Q and that source. So it's believed that Matthew is written from the Gospel of Mark and from the Gospel of Q, and we don't know who wrote that, and we don't have a copy. But virtually all scholars believe it has to exist. Because it's impossible that Mark writing in 70 in a different community than Matthew writing years later would use exactly the same phrases and exactly the same words. It's just not believable. So we know that Matthew is a great source. Now, Matthew is argued to be written by the disciple Matthew. Keep in mind now, even church tradition says Mark was a companion of Peter. So Mark was not an eyewitness. The Gospel of Matthew is claimed to be written by the disciple Matthew. And we get that because there was a teaching that we reference in the year 120 to 140 again. That there was a gospel written by Matthew in Hebrew. And so the church fathers said, this must be it. The problem is, the only copy we have is in Greek. We have nothing from the disciples. We have nothing from the Christian era ever written in Hebrew. It's interesting. Nothing. Second of all, if this was written by Matthew, he was an eyewitness. He traveled with Jesus. He's one of the disciples. Why would he need to use 91% of Mark? Why would he need to copy from a different source? But he did. Problematic. Let's get to Luke. Again, anonymous. You'll never find in the Gospel of Luke somebody saying, I'm Luke, I hung out with Jesus, or I hung out with Paul or Peter, and I'm writing this down because it's important. You don't ever get that phrase. I would tell you right now that if I had the amazing blessing to walk the earth with Jesus, I'd like to brag about it, right? I would put in my writing, hey, I'm the man. I got to travel with him. I heard him speak. He liked me, he picked me, right? You don't get any of this in the Gospels.
Weren't they fishermen?
Some of them, yeah. Yeah.
Who were basically illiterate.
Well, yeah, we pretty much know that all the followers were illiterate. In fact, we're not sure that Jesus wrote anything.
He was a rabbi.
Well, maybe. He's called a rabbi. And it's likely, he's called a rabbi in later sources. He's not called a rabbi during his teachings. And you would think that he could read because he was highly trained in Judaism, right? We do have one example of him writing. Let's see what kind of Bible scholars we had. There's one example in the Bible of Jesus writing. Do you know it?
In the sand.
Yeah.
The adulterous woman.
The adulterous woman.
We don't know that he's writing. We just know that he was poking in the sand.
Right. And so we'll talk about that. You familiar with that story? An adulterous woman is brought to Jesus, and again, the Pharisees are trying to trap him. And so she's been caught in adultery, and what most of us don't know is that in the Ten Commandments, when it says, thou shalt not commit adultery, that wasn't talking about men. Thank goodness. Only applied to women.
Really?
True story. And the death penalty, right? Stoning. For the guy, what a cad you are. Now go over there and bake some more bread. And so they bring the adulterous woman to him, and they say, we're going to kill her. Well, what do you say? And so he makes the famous comment. First, he asks some questions. He wants to confirm the truth of the story. And they say, oh yeah, caught in the act. And then he says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Now I'm paraphrasing, that's not the exact quote. But let he who is without sin cast the first stone. They go, ho, 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 ho. So they all kind of look around and they slowly drop their rocks and they walk away. Powerful, powerful teaching, right? But while he's talking to the Pharisees, he's scratching something in the dirt. And so some believe he might have been writing at that point. But other than that, we have nothing written down by Jesus. Can you imagine if we found something today written by Jesus?
Do you know what he might have been writing?
No, we don't know the story.
Where's the man?
Where's the man? Yeah, that's... But see, that was unimportant under Jewish law at that point.
Right, their sins.
But he didn't always follow Jewish law.
No, he didn't. In fact, I believe that's why he was crucified. Please.
Well, some scholars believe that story wasn't even in the Bible originally.
It's not.
Because it was in another place.
You're good. It's not. The earliest copies we have of the Bible date back to around the 400s, the 500s. Some aren't complete. We only have fragments. But in all our earliest Bibles, what I consider to be the greatest story in the New Testament is not in the earliest Bibles.
I would conjecture it was either the Decalogue or the two great commandments. Because every man would be considered guilty. And as they read those in the sand, they would have to turn away and not stone it.
Ah, good point. Okay. But again, we don't know, right? Right. We just don't know. But wouldn't it be fascinating to know? Wouldn't it be incredible? So I'm moving through this slower than I hoped. So let's get to Luke. Luke is believed to be a companion of Paul. So keep in mind now, the early church said Mark is a companion of Peter. Matthew's the real deal, although we know it can't be Matthew. 3, Luke. Luke is not an eyewitness. He's a companion of Paul. That first teaching shows up out of the Muratorian canon around 170. So that's about 140 years after the death of Jesus. But note, the Gospel of Luke is a very detailed set of stories about the actual ministry of Jesus. It's part of the first two. Mark, Matthew, and Luke are called synoptic Gospels because they largely agree with each other. In a minute we'll see that John doesn't. In fact, John almost didn't make it into the New Testament because it completely contradicts the first three Gospels. But on Luke, Paul never met Jesus, never traveled with him. Paul spent very little time with the disciples. In fact, they were usually feuding. Read Acts. Tremendous amount of argument between Paul and the other disciples. In fact, at one point in time, they ordered him back literally for trial in Jerusalem. It's all in Acts. If Luke is written by a companion of Paul, and legend has it that Luke was a physician, if it's written by a companion of Paul, Paul was not an eyewitness. So if you're writing down the things Paul is telling you about the ministry of Jesus, he didn't know anything about it. In fact, he's our first channeler. Paul is really proud in the Bible that he got no information from the other disciples. He said, everything I got was from Revelation. I downloaded everything. So he's our first mystic. He's the first Christian mystic. But if you're hanging out with Paul, you can't write the stories around Jesus. And consequently, that's why 53% of Luke is out of Mark. Acts, very similar story. We do believe that the same person wrote Acts and Luke. We get that argument somewhere around 170, 180. And Acts, we think, comes later than Luke, somewhere 80 to 100. Again, it's anonymous. Again, it's in Greek. Then we get to John. John is anonymous, but John, I would call John the equivalent of Shakespearean English, okay? I mean, this is high Greek. This is literature. In the beginning was the Word, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is powerful stuff. These are some of the greatest quotes you'll ever find in the New Testament. This is high Greek. But we know that John was a fisherman, that he was illiterate, and that he spoke Aramaic. And John is written in high Greek. You had to be highly educated Greek to write. It's like writing Shakespearean English, right? Typical English writer of the time can't write like Shakespeare. And so it's very problematic. Also, we think John is written probably 70 or 80 years after the death of Jesus. If John did write it, he would be very, very old, and he would have had to teach himself Greek and become one of the greatest writers in Greek of all time. Possible, not likely. But here's the bigger problem. It's anonymous, and it says this is being written by the disciple that Jesus loved the most. Well, we don't know who that is. Here's the bigger problem. I'm going to read this to you directly. This comes from another scholar. Gospel of John has no account of the virgin birth, no baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, no parables, no Sermon on the Mount, no temptation in the wilderness, no transfiguration while he spoke with Moses and Elijah, no account of the Last Supper. Here's the wild one. Since tomorrow is Good Friday and Sunday is Easter, here's the wild one. The cleansing of the temple occurs at the beginning of Jesus' ministry rather than the end, as in the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus is in Jerusalem for 3 Passovers in John, where the others imply that he only had a ministry for a year. And John has the crucifixion occurring 2 days before Passover. John has the dates wrong. Or John has the dates right, and Mark and Matthew and Luke have them wrong. But something's up. So if John is an eyewitness, then John has it right. And we're celebrating on the wrong day. Should have been celebrating yesterday. As I mentioned earlier, we found many Gospels, writings, Christian writings, in the 1940s. They were published by scholars and starting in the 1980s mostly. And for the first time we found all these different writings from Christians at the time of the disciples. And we found out they had very different ideas, right? Hopefully you've heard of the Gnostic Gospels, but that's a real loose phrase because many of these writings were not Gnostic. I would argue that the Gospel of Thomas is not Gnostic. Now, that's a whole nother lecture. We could have a whole day on Gnostic Gospels. Now, I mentioned Raymond Brown, the foremost Catholic scholar of the Bible. He claims there are 5 different authors of John. He was the leading living expert on the Gospel of John before he died. He says there's 5 authors. Now, keep in mind, he's reading the original Greek. He's not reading a translation. So he's looking at style and spelling and how you choose words and the whole bit. I love this. At the very end of John, John says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them was written down, I suppose even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Whoa! In other words, the New Testament's not the only thing he did and said. Whoa! That blows the top off a lot of stuff, doesn't it? And it's not imaginable that these Gospels would capture every story he told, every person he healed, every group he talked to, right? So imagine that comment. Think of the implications of that. I love that comment. So the first quote-unquote Christian Bible that we have is created around 144 AD by Marcion. And in there he only recognizes part of Luke and the letters of Paul minus the 3 pastoral letters. So in 144 AD, leading Christians thought that the 3 books of Paul called the pastoral letters were forged. So this is not a new argument. Those 3 letters ended up in the New Testament. But the earliest Christians compiling the earliest books, gathered things together, said, Paul didn't write those. Later, Clement of Alexandria, around 175 to 200, says Mark and Luke are not written by disciples. They aren't. Right? We know that for a fact. The church has never argued that Mark and Luke are disciples. Mark is a companion of Peter. Luke is a companion of Paul. Says throw those two out, but argues that John is disciples. The next reference we get is by Irenaeus, who says there has to be just 4 Gospels because there's 4 directions and 4 winds. Not good, right? So then we get to Constantine. But keep in mind, we have no church the way we think of it today. We have isolated communities. They're not in regular contact with each other. And they're under persecution. You don't get to, on Sunday morning say, come on down. Come hear the story of Jesus. No, it's a good way of getting killed or shut down or having your church burned. And so consequently, the whole early Christian movement was secret, held in people's homes. And you would love, when you read the stories that the pagans tell about the early Christians and the stories they make up about it, they're all having orgies, they're eating babies. These are incredible stories. In fact, one of the phrases that the atheists used about Christians, the pagans used about Christians the most was they called them atheists because they didn't believe in all the gods. Now, in the 2nd, 3rd century, the critics of the church from pagan sources and Greek philosophers, etc., was to call them atheists. I love the twist of that, the irony of that. Then Constantine shows up. Great story. Again, we could have a whole lecture on how Constantine changes things. It's a Roman Empire, has a conversion experience. He wins the battle, takes over as at least co-emperor of Rome, and he ends the persecution of the church. This is around 313. Momentous. Around 331, he says, how come you guys don't have a Bible? What's the matter with you guys? And so he goes to his trusted confidant, which is Eusebius, and 50 copies of the New Testament are made. We don't have any of them today. What a bummer. You imagine what a prized possession you would have today if you would have been able to hang on to one of Constantine's Bibles. Now note that this is 300 years after the death, 320 years after the death of Jesus, and 100 years later than the age of our country. So this Bible, the New Testament, is being put together really, really late, really, really long after the death of all the eyewitnesses and all the people who actually talked to the eyewitnesses, etc. They'd be all dead at this point. So Constantine says, Eusebius, go put together a Bible. And so he gathers up hundreds of different Christian writings, most of which we don't have copies of today. And he asks priests and religious figures all over the Roman world to say yay or nay, thumbs up, thumbs down, on whether that should be in the Bible. That's quite a way of choosing the good book, isn't it? And so he had 3 phrases: recognized, disputed, or spurious. Now what's interesting is we have the list that Constantine gathered from that count around the world, and it lists James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, all as disputed, and yet they're in the New Testament today. Also, Eusebius lists the book of Revelation as both disputed and recognized. So we don't know whether the book of Revelation ended up in Constantine's Bible or not. I'm going to move a little bit faster here. The next written record we have is 367. It comes by way of an Easter letter from Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria. He lists 27 books of today's New Testament as the only ones you're allowed to read. And then shortly after, lists 26 books and leaves out the book of Revelation. But around this same time, 400, 425, we have what's called the Apostolic Constitution. We have a full copy of that. And in there it lists the 26 books we have today, leaves out Revelation, but also adds 10 other books that aren't in the Bible today. So we have a lot of confusion, right? A lot of different opinions about what books are true, aren't true, should be in the Bible, etc. So then here comes the cat that changes everything, Theodosius. He's the emperor of Rome around 381. I'm going to read this exactly to you because I love this. So he passes this law. Rome adopts Christianity and outlaws all others and destroys all other texts. It is our will that all peoples ruled by the administration of our clemency shall practice that religion which the divine Peter the Apostle transmitted to the Romans. That is, according to the apostolic discipline of the evangelical doctrine, we shall believe in the single deity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Trinity. We command that persons who follow this rule shall embrace the name of Catholic Christians. So the Emperor of Rome is putting the stamp on this. Not a bishop, not a church father. The rest, however, whom we shall judge demented and insane, that's why I wanted to read this to you, shall carry the infamy of heretical dogmas. And so there's a death penalty. Death penalty if you believe anything other than Catholic Christianity, and death penalty if you possessed any book, if you didn't turn it in and destroy it. Mentioned earlier the Nag Hammadi find, where many of the Gnostic Gospels were discovered. That is a cave nearby a monastery at around this time. And it's believed that some of those monks thought, wow, we really shouldn't burn these, and hid them in those caves. That's just a guess, but a pretty good one. Believe it or not, the church never decides on the New Testament until the Council of Trent in the 1500s. And the only reason they do that is because Luther has now gone rogue, started the Protestant Reformation, and he thinks a bunch of the books of the New Testament should be out. The Catholic Church responds to that by saying, no, this is the New Testament. So the formal acceptance of the New Testament happens around 1545. Whoa, fascinating. Then we've got all the things that I will kind of go over quickly. We've got translation issues. The Bible that the church uses is in Latin. So first we have it in Greek, possibly translations from Aramaic, we don't know for sure. Then it's put into Latin, and then it's illegal to have any other translation of the Bible. Wycliffe, anybody heard of him? 1382, he says, we should have a Bible in English. So he translates the Bible from Latin. He's declared a heretic. He's already dead, so they dug up his body. The church dug up his body, and then they burned it again, just to be sure. True story. 1428. Then William Tinsdale comes along. He says, we should have a Bible in English. And he translates the first one from Greek. He's still alive, so he's strangled to death while tied at the stake. And then his dead body's burned in 1536. So, the long and the short, who do you think wrote the New Testament?
God.
God. We don't know, do we? And why is that important? Because we've reached a lot of conclusions, right, in our everyday lives, in our law, in how we view our religion, how we view our society. Politics. Look how much religion and politics have gotten caught up now. And we base these conclusions on these documents, which may or may not have been written by the people we think, may or may not be accurate translations, and have a whole host of problems. The earliest copies of the Bibles we have, as I said earlier, is from the 5th and 6th century. And they're full of misspellings, contradictions, errors. Here's my favorite. The first writings, ladies and gentlemen, had no punctuation.
Oh my goodness.
Imagine that. I can tell you that there have been lawsuits over contracts won by the placement of a comma, won by what the meant, and I'm not exaggerating. No punctuation in the earliest copies of our Bibles. Just run-on sentences. This is fascinating. I hope you think it's fascinating.
That was the way things were done at the time.
That was the way things were done at the time, exactly. But someone had to create chapters. Someone had to create paragraphs, right? And organize those. It wasn't the original writers. So, we're running out of time, so I'll get to the point. So what does this matter? Well, you have three choices. You can throw up your arms and say, oh my God, this is a bunch of crap. Right? And plenty of people have done that. There are plenty of people who attack the good book, attack Christianity, etc., say this is crap, made up stories. They pick on the Catholic Church a lot. Well, that's one way of reading this. There's another way of reading it. And that is to say, what does it matter? This is what Raymond Brown says. None of this affects his faith. He says, don't make it literal. Don't make it about these words and these words alone being true. Because when you make something true, that's when you start killing people who disagree with you, right? So the point of this is to be curious. Investigate some of this yourself. Some of the references I will give you, anything by Raymond Brown, anything by Bart Ehrman. Let me find him. E-H-R-M-A-N. E-H-R-M-A-N. Anything by Bart is worth reading. He's the head of the religious studies at University of North Carolina, and he's really brilliant. But he has lost his faith because of this knowledge. I think he's wrong, but he's brilliant. He's recognized as one of the... And he's also readable. You don't have to be a scholar to read Bart. Bart Ehrman, E-H-R-M-A-N. Please.
He also does DVD courses on Greek culture.
Oh, he does. I have them, yeah. Yeah, he's very good. One of the things I like about him, one of the things that I figured out he was worth reading is he's the only person I've ever seen that went to his publisher and said, after I publish my book, I give you permission to publish a refutation of that book by other leading scholars. Whoa. That's called confidence, right? So I read the refutations. They were a joke. And that's when I knew, Bart has something. They were never able to touch him on the facts. And then he travels around and debates. Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels, worth reading. Will, you just finished that, didn't you? Elaine Pagel's. P-A-G-E-L-S. Elaine Pagel's. And then very quickly, if you think this is interesting, here's something called the New Testament. And in here, there's 20 or 30 scholars that have said, wow, we have found these additional books, like the Gospel of Mary, like the Gospel of Thomas. Maybe they should be added into the New Testament. Maybe the canon isn't closed. And so they list 10 or 15 of the books, and they say, you know, they have rules. They have to be circulated among Christians at the time of the disciples. We have to have accurate translations. We have to know who wrote them, etc. And so they put in another 15 or 20 books in the New Testament. Fascinating, and they give their reasons for doing so. My favorite, Paul and Thecla. Thecla is a convert of Paul's who becomes a very prominent female priest. Why do you think that one's not in the New Testament? And so that's part of the problem, right? We get some politics. Remember that the folks who put all this together also, let me look at my notes, justify religious warfare, slavery, oppression of women, execution of heretics, the Inquisition. I'd come back and talk to you about the Inquisition. You love that one. Forced conversion of Jews, indigenous people, execution of witches. Why do we want to give them a pass, right? We want to think for ourselves. We want to look at what books should we believe in, should we follow? And I would urge you to undertake your own quest. So thank you so much. I know we're running out of time.